There we go. Welcome, everyone, and good morning. My name is Evan Enneman. We're here for the conversation with the craft beer professionals in the Cannabis Beverage Association. So good morning. I'll do a quick introduction for the CBA, and then I'll let our other panelists do an introduction as well. So the Cannabis Beverage Association is a national nonprofit trade association established to represent and support the rapidly growing cannabis beverage industry. Our mission is to lead the cannabis beverage industry through programs that promote the business sector, educate, and protect public health. Essentially, we are the collective voice for cannabis beverage in the US, and we do also support a lot of global efforts to create some synergies between the various disparate markets at this time. So without further ado, I will let my panelists introduce themselves, and we'll get into a discussion about cannabis beverages. So Tracy, let's start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Mason. I'm the founder and CEO of House of Saka. We make the world's first and only alcohol-removed cannabis-infused wines from Napa Valley. In addition, we are expanding our portfolio into the general market as a CBD-enriched product, as well as a non-alc high-end wine. And I also have a lot of experience in the brewing industry, working directly now with Hazy Cider and running that business as part of a joint partnership with Vintage Wine Estates, which owns Hazy Cider. But I started my career very young, working for Coors. So I kind of been there, done that. So I'm excited to speak with you all today.
Great, thank you. Chris.
My name is Chris Anderson. I'm with Bev Zero. I run their brewing operations, and I'm also representing Harmony Craft Brands as well. I do most of their production whenever we have a client that's looking to launch into the market.
Thank you, Chris. And again, my name is Evan Enneman. I'm the founder and CEO of Sands Lane, and we run Harmony Craft Beverages as well, which is a partnership as a beverage brand incubator and accelerator. We've launched now 3 brands in market, cannabis-infused beverages. One is a dealcoholized cider that's called Malus. The other is a ready-to-drink cocktail beverage, which is called Klaus. And the third is a wine brand called Herbasi. So some experience in bringing some cannabis-infused beverage brands to market. The incubator accelerator crosses both non-alcoholic and functional infused beverages, which includes cannabis. So without further ado, let's jump into things. And Tracy, if you could maybe kick us off with a broad overview of the state of cannabis and maybe the differences between cannabis and hemp and how that's being currently sold in market.
Well, gosh, that's a pretty big topic. The cannabis-infused beverage category, while extremely nascent right now, I think has the biggest potential to be the number one way people will consume cannabis in the future, for a variety of reasons, but most of which is if we use alcohol and tobacco as our backstop and how we inform ourselves about what the future is going to look like, you look at the way that combustibles have been so thoroughly villainized, whether that's tobacco or vapes or anything. And so the most common uses of the way people are consuming cannabis now, I think ultimately as we continue the march toward federal legalization, that's going to be an issue. In addition, the edibles, which are the second biggest category, their appeal to children is so clear and obvious that also I think has a big problem. But we've really focused on creating sophisticated adult beverages for sophisticated adults, and so I don't think there's any crossover really between what we're doing in the cannabis space versus other categories. In CBD, it's interesting because the markets are very similar in the sense that the legal markets, when I say legal, I mean adult use markets, are paralleling with CBD infused beverages as well. So there's about 18 states right now where you can sell CBD infused beverages. The it's a little bit wishy-washy in terms of what you can actually call it. For the products that we're releasing to market in the next couple of weeks, we're calling them hemp extract infused, just because in certain states you can say CBD and others you can't. So to drive efficiencies, we're calling it hemp extract infused. But there are tremendous benefits to CBD if it's used in the right way. The challenge I think that we have as an industry is to ensure that CBD is actually effective, and it's not just a buzzword. Because I think we run a very, 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 very strong risk of CBD being the snake oil of our generation, in the sense that if we're not clear about what CBD actually does, and if we're not very specific on the amount of dosage that's going into each of our products, then and people aren't actually feeling the effects of CBD, in a relaxation mode, in a focus mode, or whatever effect-driven combination we want, there's a challenge there too. So I think as operators, Evan, you and I've known each other for a while now. As operators, there's a lot on our plates in terms of being responsible and delivering the message and delivering the category in a way that makes sense and that really drives, I think, ultimately consumer acceptance to the category.
Yeah, and there's a lot of challenges which we'll get into during the conversation. But when we look at the broad landscape, it's really interesting how many different types of beverages we're seeing come into market, and it's really now bifurcating the market into what is a regulated cannabis space, where people think of as traditional THC only beverages, and then there's the regulated hemp space, which is what your point was related to CBD, and the various regulatory frameworks that we have to really think about to bring these two regulated products to market, because hemp and CBD is still regulated in many ways, and not just at a federal level under the Farm Bill, but also at state levels too. So, but watching people come out with innovative brands and products, whether it be, a CBD water all the way to a really potent, what looks like a 5-hour energy shot with 100 milligrams of, a THC infused beverage, you see this broad range of what's starting to mimic traditional bev alc and even some traditional just beverages categories in general. So it'll be interesting to see how many more brands and products come to market, and in this case there's really an interesting parallel to a movement in the non-alcoholic or low alcoholic space, specifically with beer, and that's two different ways of getting beer prepared to be brought to market. So in the cannabis space, we can't have any alcohol in our beverages before they're infused. So there's some challenges there, but there are some techniques to creating a good base product, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and Chris will point to you for that. It's interesting, beer has not taken up a large segment of the category yet in cannabis specifically. So it'll be interesting to see why that is, and we've had a few that have started, and Chris, you've known a few, and would love to get your thoughts on those that have started and who hasn't. But maybe let's talk about the process for creating a good non-alcoholic beer. What are some of the methods? What are things that you're seeing in market that are working well and others that haven't held up to creating a good base for infused beverages?
Yeah, I think the key there is good. I think in my opinion, I'm kind of leaning towards the dealcoholization piece in terms of quality, and the flavor being paramount. Of course, there's arrested fermentation, which is probably the most common and the easiest to do within an existing brewing facility, because you really don't need to buy anything other than yeast or a different malt per se. The next step from that would probably be filtration, which would be a complex set of filters that would basically remove the alcohol and separate the NA stream in another stream, as well as the alcohol comes off. Usually, and if you're landing this in a brewing facility, that process would water back the process removed or the permeate piece. So anything would, if you're running a 7% beer or a 5% beer, a 5% seltzer comes out the other end. That's the limitation on that. Without that, you would probably require a dealcoholization permit, which would be a DSP or distillation permit to be able to do the process that we do with Bev Zero, which is removing the alcohol. And essentially we do that in wine, beer, and cider. And we feel like it's the best approach because we basically take any beer down to a 0-0 state, and then we can build back with the very first product that comes off during distillation, which is the essence or the volatile aroma capture. So that piece allows us to basically build back in whatever integrity of the product that we're running into the we call it the go low is the machine that we run. But regardless if we're doing that or using an SEC, a spinning cone column, the process is literally the same in terms of, building back with a certain constituent of whatever you're running through. So, I'm kind of impartial, mostly because I started out in the industry working with filtration, and I thought that was the cat's meow. I worked for a company for about 5 years doing all the development, using that technology. And at the time, this type of distillation wasn't really prominent. And then to kind of come full circle to where we're at today, I feel really good about where we're at, and certainly the products that are being produced.
So Tracy, maybe speak a little bit. So that process Chris is mentioning for beer is very similar to what's going to happen in wine. So you're going to de-alc down to a base product, build back to what you want, but then a very critical step in that, in addition to finding the right base product that you want to have for the infusion. Can you speak a little bit to the process of now infusing that base product that you've developed? What does your process look like for House of Sako or for other brands that you've overseen?
Well, I mean, I think, honestly, we're working right now on an alcohol removed CBD infused ACE cider. And I actually found that because, cider is only about 5% alcohol, you're not losing as much when you take the alcohol away. Comparative to wine, which is anywhere between 12 to 16%, depending on what they put on the label. But the truth is that you lose quite a bit when you remove alcohol, especially from wine, because you're losing a perception of sweetness. You're losing a perception of weight on your palate. And so when you remove the alcohol, building back those flavor components, and even with some of the reserve essence that Chris talked about earlier, you still have to be super aware of the flavor compounds that you're really targeting. And so we work with natural flavors and essences and to kind of build back those flavor compounds. And then it becomes equally challenging because when you're using a CBD emulsion, you're getting a bit of bitterness from the emulsion, from what it is that creates the emulsion itself. So it's not necessarily the cannabis; it's actually the materials that's used to actually break that cannabis oil down into microscopic particles. And the challenge is, the bigger those particles, the less bitter it is. But what you give up in exchange for lack of bitterness is you give up clarity. So the clearer the product, the more surface area you have on your tongue, the more bitter it becomes. And those, in fairness, those technologies are improving literally every day. I mean, where we were 3 years ago compared to where we are now is vastly different. So it's not, when you're building back a wine compound or a cider compound, you're not just looking at how do I make this taste sort of like wine, even though it's technically not wine anymore. It's how do I make those flavor compounds also marry to the emulsion itself, and make sure that they're working together as opposed to hitting up against each other. And I think with certain varietals, it's easier. I think with like a Sauvignon Blanc that already has that sort of like grassy flavor to it, it's easier. But for a rosé, which is our number one seller, it's actually very hard because there's not a lot of meat on that bone. If you think about it, there's a lot with Chardonnay, there's a lot with Sauvignon Blanc, there's a lot with Cabernet. But with rosé, everyone's perception of what a rosé should taste like is different. And also, so then targeting those specific flavors isn't as easy. Whereas Chardonnay, you can say, oh, I want it to taste like butter or popcorn or oak, or Cabernet, you want it to be tannic and oaky. And whereas rosé is hard. So, all this to say that while it's really fun and interesting process, it's also a very difficult one. And we've been really fortunate to be able to have relied on Bev Zero really since we thought about it, since we were just thinking about what we wanted to do with House of Saka. So it's been a really great partnership.
So it sounds like that the base product is a really difficult product to get locked in, because you're now changing the profile of what a distilled wine, beer, spirit would look like, and how we're used to that on our palate and the flavor profiles and everything else. So we're changing our own personal expectations of what we're about to drink, which is an interesting challenge that we'll have to solve for. But then also the infusion, the emulsion part is a really challenging part of this process. And then to marry those two together is what you're talking about, finding a really balanced, high quality beverage as what we're bringing to market. So with the emulsion technology or water soluble technologies, what are those things that you're seeing right now on the infusion side that's interesting you in that advancement of that technology? Is it the same nanotechnology early onset? Is it some form of water soluble, so you don't have that carrier oil or whatever it may be? What are you seeing in this space now?
I mean, I think that the industry is moving at the speed of light. I mean, and so water soluble is really, really interesting to me. I think part of the challenge that I have personally and professionally is that I'm highly loyal. And so because again, Bev Zero and Fermentation, our infusion partner, has been with us since the beginning, have worked so closely with us. I kind of struggle with it because I want to remain loyal to those who've been loyal to me. That said, it's all about what the consumer experience is, right? And what I love about nanotechnology is the early onset. It's that, you feel the effects within 5 to 15 minutes, like you would a glass of wine. And I also like the relatively fast offset. So you're not as high for as long. But what I don't like, honestly, is the flavor component that we have to kind of combat, if you will, and really think through of how we're gonna marry to the flavor compounds we're trying to create in our products. So I think the technology is improving, and we're always looking and tasting and evaluating what the next big thing will be. But I will tell you that, every time we do a vintage, every new vintage, so now we're going to be on our 4th vintage of Saka Pink that we're producing next month. It's changed, and it's gotten better. And so, and I think, I created it, so I'm a little biased, but I think the product was amazing to begin with, and it just gets better and better. And I think for those who are entering the in space or interested in entering the space, they're in a much better place than you and I were, Evan, 5 years ago. So it's really exciting place to be.
Well, that's great perspective. And Chris, maybe we'll turn back to you, and before we talk about the market a little bit more and really understand some of the things that you've brought up as well in the past in our conversations, and you alluded to it in some of the intro piece here, which is, what are some of the challenges to bring a high quality beer in a cannabis infused model to market, given some of those challenges of maintaining flavor and mouthfeel and all these different profiles that you want to have in a high quality beer, and which ones maybe stand up better to a dealcoholization or an arrested fermentation, and then ultimately an infusion that might fit with the cannabis infused side of either CBD or THC?
I mean, on the positive side, we can formulate specifically beer versus cider or even wine specifically for the dealc piece. So we can formulate for the known quotients that are going to be happening within this distillation unit. So we know that concentration of hops is going to be a problem, and that we're going to have to do a reduction in the bittering piece, especially when we infuse more cannabis. And then secondly, loss of head retention and loss of foam retention and mouthfeel. All these things we have a means to circumvent those by formulating and doing this in the front end with our building. Unfortunately, with wine and cider, you can't do that, and that's probably the biggest difficulty. The second thing that I can think of is the obviously with losing one of our co-pack manufacturing facilities in Northern California, it's really put a hamper on the ability to get product into market. And certainly with anything that is produced, dealcoholized, and then shipped to a facility, that poses another cost, another issue with potential oxidation. Beer is a lot more fragile than wine or cider in terms of that, and it tasting poorly by the time it arrives. So you really have to be cognizant of that and do a very good job of getting all the oxygen out of the vessel that it's going into, your transfer vessel that you're going to be moving it to. I can't think of a single facility in the state that has a brewing facility on the same grounds as the production facility. But obviously, in a perfect world, that's what needs to happen. Having it be very close by would be ideal, so that you could kind of work around that issue. But that's certainly the biggest problem with beer is just getting it from point A to point B to where you can finish it, process it, infuse it, and have it be successful. I know right now I have one facility in the entire state that I'm driving anybody that's doing infused beer to. So it makes it really tough. I wouldn't send anybody to just any facility. I've been hearing about a new facility coming online that's going to be pretty state of the art down in LA, but in terms of when they're going to be online, I don't know. But yeah, right now there's really one player in the entire game in terms of the state of California that can even handle beer and do it successfully, which makes it very difficult.
Yeah, well, you talked about some specific product challenges, and maybe even the bigger one is the supply chain challenges that we have in the infused category. Maybe we'll speak to that a little bit. You mentioned California, so there are a few co-packers that are coming online, most of whom are looking to really pack their own brands, not necessarily be a co-packer, but they're offering up some line time. What is the challenge that you see if we don't have enough line time in bringing something that normally is maybe a higher volume type product like a beer on the market? Is that going to limit the ability for brewers to get to an infused cannabis space, whether it's craft or not? Or do you think we're going to have more infrastructure built, not just in California, but in other key markets? I mean, we could look at Colorado and Washington and the Northeast, and as markets come online, what's your thought around getting enough manufacturing facilities to support the demand? Is there the demand? I mean, I think we know very well in just pure across the board alcohol, consumers are looking to explore non-alcoholic and other types of alternative adult beverages. So what are your thoughts on the supply chain side for manufacturing specifically?
Yeah, it seems to be a problem. It doesn't seem like it's going to go away. It seems like it's going to continue to rear its head. I think sooner or later people are going to understand that if they make the investment in the production facility, that filling that line time, I'm assuming that typically what you're going to see is somebody that is producing their own brands and then has that time when they're not running their own product. And I'm assuming you're going to see a lot more of that in the future, where people are building out a facility specifically for their own needs. I can think of about 3 or 4 that are going to be coming online in the next 6 months. That will be the case. Now, how long is that going to last, and how long can a brewer or a manufacturer rely on them to be a co-pack partner? That's really the tough part, because as soon as that brand's velocity grows to the point where they can no longer do it, they just cut you off. And that's similar to what happened with this co-packer that shut down in Northern California, when they sold out. So I think you'll see more of that. Unfortunately, I don't really see anybody biting off and building a facility specifically for production on their own, like what this Northern California facility did. I think almost wholeheartedly the investment makes more sense when you have something to rely on to keep some production rolling. But I think overall, I think in the future, I think it's going to be more or less that kind of capacity where we're seeing production facilities opening that are catering to their own needs, but also can cater to some of the other folks' needs as well.
So in your view, and Trace, would love to get your perspective on this too, does cannabis-infused beverages, or even more narrowly, cannabis-infused beer, it sounds like it looks much more like a very localized or even regionalized craft beer market, in the sense that you're going to have multiple small producers in different markets, whether it's creating seasonality within their profile or whatever it may be very differently. Is that what you see as the future, at least in the immediate term, for cannabis infused beer, or do you see more of that top down, ABI Molson Coors model, sort of trying to bring consistent branding across the U.S. very quickly?
I don't see those guys getting into the game until it's full legal. I think it's going to stay, somewhat regulated into that space, at least for now. But I think once it goes full legal in most states, I think those guys are going to certainly, use investments that they already have existing to produce the beer, and then build other offsite infusion facilities to meet the need. But I just don't see them making that investment right now in the state we're in, because it just seems to be that we're stuck in this cycle that we have a lot of brands that want to get to market but are unable to, just because of the ability to get co-packed.
Yeah. So Tracy, I mean, cannabis beverages within the broader cannabis space is, probably sub 2% of the category broadly, but we're growing very rapidly. I think it's up almost over 350% in the last 2 to 3 years. So we have significant year-on-year growth. What are some of those challenges, whether it be supply chain, retail choke points, that you see for infused beverage brands, and what are the ways that we can maneuver those or outmaneuver them?
I mean, gosh, there's so many chokeholds, if you will, in the space. Everything from, as Chris articulated, getting the product in a bottle, and then getting it to market, getting paid for that product once it's in market. It's a very, very complicated, and it's not for the faint of heart by any stretch of the imagination. I think when you enter the space, for those of you who are listening to this, I think you have to come at it with an extreme, understand that nothing that you think is going to happen will happen. And like any innovation, it takes time to really build that momentum. I think that, I think the parallel that you made between craft breweries, the regionalization of them, is an excellent point. And I think what's also driving that is because when you think about a brand, any real brand that that you are akin to, if you will, whether it's the car you drive or the clothes you wear or the glasses you wear, whatever that looks like, it's always tied to something. Real brands are tied to provenance. And so they're tied to a specific place, whether it's Provence or Paris or Milan or Germany or whatever it is. And with cannabis, because the base product has to be from the state, it's really hard to achieve that notion of provenance, which means it's really hard to build a real brand. I mean, I think House of Saka kind of stands alone in that respect, because we don't rely on the cannabis to deliver that provenance. We rely on Napa Valley, our base product, So Napa Valley translates whether you're in Michigan or whether you're in California or you're in Massachusetts, whereas the cannabis grown there doesn't, right? And so I think it's going to take time, but we will get there. And I think big players coming into the scene, I mean, they're already dabbling in it, right? Whether it's Constellation or InBev or whomever, they're dabbling, and they're dabbling, with an eye on full legalization. But I do think full legalization is a way, way, way off. I don't see it happening, at least in the next 5 years. But I do see regulations loosening up. I see banking loosening up. I see interstate commerce potentially loosening up. But I don't see, and especially with adjacent states like the West Coast, I could see us, trading cannabis between Nevada and Oregon and Washington. But in the meantime, you have to have extreme stick-to-itiveness, and you have to be really nimble and figure out how to continue to thrive and build a brand in a very, very challenging environment. And if you don't have that level of stick-to-itiveness, you're not gonna win. And I'm not pretending that I know that House of Sake is going to win, but I do know that we've spent a tremendous amount of time and resources, and I don't mean financial resources, I mean literally intellectual resources, in figuring out backstops to allow us to continue to build our business while we're waiting for the cannabis industry to figure itself out.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic right now, building brand, to your point, which does take time, and it requires some point of reference, whether it be provenance or some story that sort of ignites from that inspiration to create a brand and the narrative that persists for some time, or some purpose behind it. So it's actually a good time to build brand if you're thinking long term. And that's really what, I know when people say, well, that all sounds great, we want to do something, and they get really excited, and it's the time to say, oh, we're going to launch a new brand or launch a new product, and the category is going to be huge. And I think we all know, yes, it will be at some point, but as brands happen, it takes either a tremendous amount of money or a tremendous amount of time, and neither one is the sole indicator of success. So what I think is interesting in this space, and Tracy said it best, is stick-to-itiveness. It's the ability to be resilient beyond any other industry category. Beer, broadly, is regulated, but it's a very clear, consistent market that's been regulated for a very long time, even though it may have differences state to state. Cannabis, however, is very, very different in that it's newly regulated and has significant differences state to state, even in the fact that you can't transport anything across state lines, with the exception of, if possible, a dealcoholized based product that you're going to infuse in a different market. So there are some things within the space now that we can still work around. We can still develop products, and we can still transport high quality based products. We just have to figure out, the market by market dynamic if we're trying to create consistency. But therein too, I think, lies a real advantage for people that are willing to build brands today. So brewers that may have a following, a real strong following, can replicate that brand in other markets and tap into other day parts or use cases, depending on what that may be for their brands. Or folks looking to get in directly, and they've been a lover of beer, and they've been a beverage entrepreneur, they want to get in. Certainly there's a pathway, but I think, to Tracy's point, really understand this market is a very unforgiving one, and find resources that can help you, find experts that have been doing this for some time, and recognize that no one has the perfect answer yet. So even the biggest brands that you see in the market today, all doing different things, all very positive, because really what we're looking for is the growth of the category, which is having more beverages available for people to switch if they want to switch, or for them to explore if they want to explore a cannabis-infused beverage, or just have it with different use cases, as we were talking about before. So it's an exciting time. So all these challenges that we're hearing, I kind of see them as net positives if you have that both emotional and physical fortitude to stick with it for the next many years until supply chains correct and, we have the retail outlets that we want to have. So, to talk about that a little bit more, Chris, is there, for those brewers out there, is there a beer that stands up better to an infusion? Is there a profile of a beer? Is it a hoppier beer? What type of format should people be considering if they're going to then ultimately look to infuse it?
Yeah, going back to what Tracy was talking about the emulsion itself, I think it lends better to beer, because beer always has that yin yang component with the malt and the hop complexity, which hops have always provided bitterness to balance out the sweetness of malt. So with that respects, anything hoppy, you nailed it on the head. Anything with that boasts a large terpene profile. A lot of cannabis and hops are sisters. So they're both from the Cannabisaceae family, and a lot of the flavors are synonymous between the two. So marrying that into a flavor profile that works better, is going to be more harmonious in beer. And that being said, there is the issue with another component adding to the emulsion that provides bitterness. And most people, when they're brewing a beer, the king style right now is a hazy IPA. So there's no concern with it being clear, and in fact, you want to have the beer be hazy. So that product isn't needed, and it's going to lend real well to products that don't have this clear emulsion piece, but can provide this full range flavor profile that would be assimilate with what you personify with hops. And usually, what we see in craft beer right now is building in those flavor profiles, obviously post de-alc, because you don't want to flash off any of those aromas, that's pretty much what we've seen so far.
So I'm getting excited to hear that there might be some more beers coming out to market, more of these flavorful profiles and things that I think would pair really well with well-grown, strain specific or cultivar specific flavor profiles. So that's going to be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to that. So thinking about that and understanding, trying to bring brands to market, and Tracy, you've now been, coming from the alcohol world, been in the cannabis space for a long enough time to know a lot of the challenges, but also the ways to navigate those. What are some of the things that you're seeing working well for brands, and then tactics that you've seen either work well from alcohol or not work well from alcohol in the cannabis space?
When you say what's working, do you mean from a formulation?
Like marketing, like branding, marketing, things that get consumers access and interested for trial.
Well, I mean, again, it's a very, very regulated environment. So actually getting to the consumer is a really difficult thing to do, because we're so regulated in advertising and social media and all the ways in which that you would normally connect with a consumer, we're really highly restricted in. So you have to be really creative. For us, it's about, I think, being very, very, very consumer specific in targeting who our consumer is, and working with our retail partners to target that consumer in the right way. So in other words, that means like being very, very specific about the types of places where we sell our product. So sort of going more narrow and deep as opposed to trying to be all things to all people, because we just frankly can't be. And so leveraging their internal infrastructures and their customer, their CRM models or whatever that looks like to talk to our consumer directly there. And then we do some limited print, but again, very specific to our demographic. Like our number one market is Marin County in California, which is a very, very affluent area. And it's where our consumer lives. Right. And so we're able to really focus on that area, and it's really done a great job for us in being able to do that. But it's not an easy thing. And again, when coming from alcohol, I'm used to self-regulating and, carrying responsible consumption messaging and everything that we do. And, but the industry itself, I mean, there's bad actors everywhere. And we just try to really stay above the fray, in everything we do, because ultimately if a Diageo, if a Constellation has their eyes on us, it's really important that we're staying, true to our values and making sure that we're self-regulating before they even start to look at us. Because if they see us trying to attract children or kids, that's not going to work. So.
Yeah, and I think for everyone interested in looking at the space is recognizing the regulatory differences. So you do have to think about the market you're operating in. California has different trade sampling and consumer sampling rules built into our regulatory framework. Michigan or Nevada or Colorado or Massachusetts, they all have different rules related to that in terms of how can you sample product through a retailer, through a specific activation for consumers. all these things become very different. You can't just have a license at any event, show up and just sample your product. It's a much more difficult process to, at least in California, have to partner with a retailer in order to provide trade samples that then get, essentially provided by someone outside of the brand to a consumer. So it's not a very clear one-to-one relationship. And to your point, it creates some of those difficulties of having real brand affinity with consumers.
And I also think that there's so much confusion within the space itself by dispensary operators. For example, I was shipping something the other day and I saw that there was a new dispensary that just opened in Napa. So I popped in and I happened to have samples in my car because I had partnered with a retailer and I bought the samples and I had them in my car. And I walked in and I said, hey, these are completely metric compliant. They've gone through the system. They're now off the grid because, they've been purchased, gone through and as a private citizen, I can give you these samples, but they wouldn't take them.
Yeah.
Even though technically legal, but they're so worried about the regulations, and I don't blame them. So now I have to go and spend, $200 to have samples delivered when I was standing there with them in my hand. It's
absurd. And multiply that $200 per sample by 200 doors.
Exactly.
And the cost to even drop a sample is exorbitant, especially for a smaller brand trying to get to market. So a lot of challenges that you wouldn't normally think about in our space, we have them, and it's true because people want to make sure they're staying compliant in the event there's an opportunity to both scale their business and ultimately sell it. You don't want to have too many skeletons in your closet because there are always going to be some in the cannabis space initially, just trying to understand and navigate because the regulations change almost daily. Sometimes folks don't know if they're in compliance or not, and you have to go back and relabel or anything else. So, with that, I certainly want to open up the floor to questions. If anyone has them, please drop them in the chat and we will certainly get to them. If it's for any one of us or all of us, please certainly do that. The message I heard from you, Tracy, there is really consult with experts, not just on, product formulation and the right emulsifications to be using and everything else, to co-packing and distribution, but also in retail, understanding how you can get to a consumer is a really challenging space in cannabis. So working with folks who've done it in the past or who have potentially access to a targeted consumer demographic, those are the ones to really work with and partner with to the extent you can.
I mean, if you think about it in the context of classic marketing, right? I mean, there's really two intertwined circles. You have your consideration techniques. Here is a bunch of brands, and you create an environment where, as a marketer, that people then add your brand to their consideration set. When I'm buying a car, I might have 7 different brands in my consideration set. And ultimately then the tactics that we take to convert me to actually buying that car are going to come in at in a much more palatable way, if you will. So it'll be like, well, who has the best warranty? Who has the best, gas mileage right now? Who has, and so who's going to give me the best deal? And that ultimately, and then my experience with the product will ultimately convert me right to a buyer. And so for us, what we're doing to drive that consideration factor is, add me to your consideration set is by building House of Saka brand reputation, taste profile in the general market. So when you're in a Target or when you're in a package store and you see House of Saka as a high-end alcohol removed wine or CBD enriched wine, it allows you that we have a much broader base, right, of talking to that consumer, so that when that same consumer theoretically walks into a dispensary in California, and it's like, I'm familiar with that brand, it's in my consideration set. So that conversion factor is that much easier. Mm-hmm. And so, but in the absence of having that broad palette to paint on that we have now with the general market, it's super challenging. And people are doing really stupid things, giving product away. And just when I say stupid, I don't mean stupid tactically. I mean, it's just not sustainable. right? And it doesn't do the industry any good because, when you're raising tens of millions of dollars and you're blowing it by giving your product away, you're not really creating a brand. You're just creating it's like a false flag, if you're in the military.
Yeah. I know every brand's trying to do what they think is best, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean we're helping to educate the consumers in the best way that they need to be educated, which is a broad-based way of getting them to try various products. So there's clearly tactics that will work for some and not for others. There's a good question I want to get to before we take any others and go forward. Chris was asking in regards to consumption limits on site and how do we manage the amount consumed by an individual or if you're doing to-go packaging. So great question. Cannabis consumption lounges are very few and far between anywhere in the US. We are finally starting to see this come together in California and some other markets as well. And we'll only speak about the regulated ones, the ones that are licensed by the state, because there are many cannabis clubs that are unregulated or unlicensed by the state right now. So setting those aside, there are very few. And right now, the way it works is that the food or beverage, in our case, beverage today, has to be prepackaged. So you have to buy your can from a retailer, which is ostensibly next door to the consumption space. And then you can open up that packaged good and consume it on site. You can pour it into a glass. You can do whatever you want with it, but you're buying it packaged. So there's no concept of a tap or anything yet, or a gun or really mixology, for the lack of a better way to look at it the same way. So what we're seeing now is we don't have good guidelines yet, like you might have with tips and sort of training bartenders. That is something that will be evolving as more consumption lounges come online, but it will be very similar to trying to understand if someone is overly intoxicated, how do you help them? There is no program for that yet. So, going back to Tracy, self-regulating, operators of consumption lounges will have to define, at least today, their own best practices for monitoring and managing individual consumption on site, especially if they feel that person may be driving or operating some vehicle thereafter. So, good messaging, good guidelines, don't consume and drive, all these types of things that we'll have to do and train bud tenders on is, look for people that might be overly intoxicated in some way and try and understand the dynamic of, how they're leaving or how they're getting home. But primarily everything today is a packaged product that then gets opened and consumed. So great question. And we're excited to see consumption lounges because that's how we're going to get consumers to sample more products. So
in our area too, we have one of them, in the Coachella Valley where I live. And, I think it's different than Bev Alc or other consumption in that it's going to affect everybody differently depending on how much you consume and what your tolerance are. And it points back to the server a little bit and to that they maybe don't understand that, and whether somebody drinks a 10 milligram drink and is completely wrecked, where another person might be able to drink 4 or 5 of them, it's going to be quite a bit different for each person and each instance. But I think, a lot of that's going to take, certainly driven by the CBA and some of the other entities that kind of can provide insight on that, because I don't think, your average bud tender is going to be cognizant of that or, be aware of how that's going to be affecting each person.
Well, let's speak to maybe some of the broader topics and where this is all going, and maybe Trace, we'll start with you. Where do you see the cannabis beverage industry heading, and how big do you think it is? Does that really compete with Bev Alc? Does it support it? What do you see as the landscape there and the size of the market?
Well, again, the market is changing every day. But what we do know is that consumers who consume cannabis beverages or cannabis in general also consume alcohol. By and large, the vast majority of consumers consume both, maybe not at the same occasion. Cannabis tends to be a more singular occasion or more personal occasion, whereas Bev-Al tends to be more social. And obviously there's a lot more avenues through which to experience that social ability than there is with cannabis. But I do see, because of the social nature of beverage in general, I do see that being the delivery mechanism, as I said earlier, of the future. And because of the precise dosing, unlike if you went into a consumption lounge and someone gave me a hit off a joint that I have no idea what the potency of that joint is and how it's going to affect me. Conversely, I know exactly what 5 milligrams is going to do to me. I know exactly how that's going to make me feel. And the benefit of beverages, you'll know how it's going to make you feel very quickly, as opposed to waiting, an hour to get processed through your liver and converting into a different cannabinoid altogether. So I do see that, the industry continuing to grow and thrive. I'm sorry, my windows are open, so I fly. So I do see the industry continuing to thrive. I do think, it's interesting to me, the cannabis industry tends to work against itself a lot. So when I say that, I mean specifically with consumption lounges. Unless the cannabis industry, I think, starts to think about it in the context of we need to take small steps, and you're not going to leap into this environment where, people are toking up right next to someone who maybe just wants to have a cannabis-infused beer, right? The smoking is the biggest issue. It's the biggest issue as it relates to municipalities and the smell that comes with it. And so, here in Napa, I've been lobbying. I'm a part of them as well as the CBA. And I've been lobbying my colleagues to say, hey, let's lobby for consumption lounges for edibles and beverages only. And people who are legacy users of cannabis are vehemently against it, because they're like, if we can't smoke, we don't want it. I'm like, well, that's a little short-sighted, because maybe one leads to the other, but the reality is, in an environment like Napa Valley, where it's all about aroma and taste and you're not going to get a consumption lounge on Main Street. It's not going to happen. So how about we walk before we run, right?
Yeah, and the bigger opportunity is having cannabis anywhere you can have a beverage, which means you clearly cannot smoke in those environments, which is restaurants and event spaces like that. So yeah, the long game is certainly to have it available everywhere, and having the ability to create smokeless consumption lounges would be a great first step, because then people can enjoy the experience without potentially smoking if they don't want to smoke themselves or sit in a cloud of smoke, which no matter how good your exhaust system is, you're sitting in a cloud of smoke. So, hopefully your colleagues can see and understand that and support that. Certainly on behalf of the Cannabis Beverage Association, we support that. So Chris, maybe a couple last words and your thought around, where the space is going around beer, what we can think about cannabis infused beer and anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll agree. I think the future is bright for everything in the space. I think beer will just continue to grow. Certainly with the availability of having access to better components that are flavor driven in terms of emulsion, live resins and that whole piece has been huge in terms of building in a profile that harmonizes really well with beer and is synonymous with hopping. I think in the future, I think it's going to go back to what I mentioned earlier. It's just having the ability to be able to guide people into the industry and be able to do so seamlessly with hopefully with more than one opportunity to be able to do so. Right now, our only opportunity is in Southern California. So if we're producing the beer in Northern California, shipping it down to Southern California just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of financial sense. And at the end of the day, whether it's cannabis or not, there's only so much meat on the bone at the end of the day. And I think a lot of people have this misconception that any beverage sold in the cannabis industry should be marked up just as flour and all that stuff would. So a lot of the guys that are working these dispensaries really need to be educated that, like, hey, listen, like, that's not going to work for us. I don't think it's going to work for anybody. And I think it's going to put us in a real bad situation moving forward. Those are the main things that I can think of. I think I think the future's bright. I think the only limitation is having somebody with the willingness to get in the business and being able to cater to larger client bases. I think this new customer, when they get into the business, because they come from big beer, I think they have probably the best understanding that I've seen since I've been in the business here in California, and I think they probably hold the most weight in terms of having the ability to first of all afford it. That's the hardest part, is being able to capitalize that initial investment. Most places that are getting started don't have the willingness to make the spend for 320-minute KHS canning line. You know what I mean? That's a $1.5 million spend. So it's not exactly cheap, and your ROI on that is going to be significant. So I think based on kind of what I'm seeing and where things are going, I think we're poised and moving in the right direction. I think it's just, at this point, the limitation is just on the amount of places that we can be able to co-pack and produce through.
Well, I appreciate that. I know there's one final question that I'll try and get to and wrap into the closing here. A question around some sort of negative connotation towards cannabis-infused beverages from some other group, and I'm assuming that's alcohol producers, beer producers, or something along those lines. So there definitely is a little bit of that stigma still there in the challenge, but the reality is consumers consume both. Consumers appreciate and like both, so consumers are going to always consume both. And finding the best way to support consumer preferences is really what we in the brand space are intending to do, and obviously the supply chains needed to get there. So a lot of great opportunities for cannabis beverage in the future. Hopefully anyone here is a brewer or retailer that's looking to get involved, please certainly reach out and do so, either to the Cannabis Beverage Association, just cannabisbeverageassociation.org, or to any one of us, Chris, Tracy, myself, will always be available to answer any questions for you, and happy to help you navigate, where you need to get involved. So the question's out, the OGs not loving to see change. Well, that's every industry. OGs don't like to see change, but like I just said, consumers, we're human. We like change, even if it's driven by us or not. It's inevitable. So there's definitely a love for people that appreciate pairing, good flower with good, brewing or beverage techniques and creating high quality products. So, if you have a love for the process and the product that you're putting out and give it to consumers, and you focus on hospitality, I think everyone does appreciate that. So thank you all again. Appreciate your time. Thank you to Chris and Tracy for your time this morning.
Great to see you, Evan. Nice to see you, Chris.
Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Bye, guys.